The faint crackle of the fire in the hearth was interrupted by the sharp knock of urgency at the door. Holmes, ever attentive, raised an eyebrow, his sharp features illuminated by the glow of the flames. I set aside my journal, glancing toward the entryway. "Expecting company, Holmes?" I ventured. Holmes offered a slight smile. "No, Watson, but I seldom refuse an uninvited guest. Do let Mrs. Hudson admit them." Moments later, a woman entered, her face pale, her gloved hands trembling against the folds of a black veil. She carried with her an aura of desperation, the kind that clings to one in dire straits. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she began, her voice a fragile whisper, "I am Lady Evelyn Blackthorne. I implore your assistance in a matter of great urgency. My brother Edward has vanished." Holmes inclined his head, motioning for her to sit. "Pray, take a moment to compose yourself. Then recount your story in full." She clutched a leather-bound case to her chest. "Edward is a cryptologist, a genius who has served the crown. 3 nights ago, he vanished from his study, leaving behind only this." She opened the case, revealing a single parchment covered in peculiar markings. Holmes took it with delicate precision, studying it under the lamp. "Fascinating. Lady Evelyn, your brother's work, I assume, is of considerable importance." She nodded. "He was decoding sensitive documents, dangerous ones." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Dangerous indeed. Fear not, madam. We shall find your brother." Holmes had retreated to his desk, the cipher spread before him. His fingers drummed lightly against the wood as his sharp eyes darted across the symbols. "Remarkable," he murmured, adjusting the magnifying glass he held. "Each symbol appears deliberate, part of a layered code. Observe here, Watson. This sequence repeats, suggesting a substitution cipher. Yet there is something more." I peered over his shoulder, struggling to grasp the intricacy. "And what might that be?" "The sigil in the corner," Holmes said, pointing to a curious marking at the bottom of the parchment. "This symbol is not merely decorative. It is a signature, one I have seen before." He paused, his expression darkening. "Years ago, during the Marseille affair, this symbol was linked to a network of operatives known as the Shadow Syndicate. They operate in secrecy, their motives always veiled. If Edward's work caught their attention, the matter is graver than I anticipated." I frowned. "And the cipher itself, can you break it?" Holmes leaned back, his gaze unyielding. "I intend to. For now, we must gather context. Watson, retrieve the notes on cryptology from my bookshelf. This cipher holds a key, and with it, perhaps the means to save Edward." As Holmes immersed himself in the intricacies of the cipher, I turned my attention to the fragments Lady Evelyn had provided. The bookshelves yielded accounts of cryptologists, brilliant minds who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. "Holmes," I said, my tone heavy, "there is a disturbing pattern here. Cryptologists across Europe have disappeared in the past 2 years. Each had ties to sensitive work, and each case remains unsolved." Holmes glanced up, his face impassive. "The Shadow Syndicate is thorough, Watson. They leave no loose ends. These vanishings are their work, without question." A shiver passed through me. "If they've taken Edward—" Holmes interrupted. "Then time is not on our side. We must act swiftly." He returned to the cipher with renewed focus, his mind turning like a well-oiled machine. The room was silent, save for the scratching of his pen as the first threads of the mystery began to unravel. The fire crackled softly in the hearth as Holmes leaned over his desk, his gaze fixed on the cipher. His hands moved with precision, a pencil tracing symbols and numbers across a sheet of paper. The air in the room hung thick with anticipation, the ticking of the clock marking the passage of time. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly without looking up, "do you recall our old acquaintance Colonel Darcy?" A man of peculiar habits but a keen mind for codes. I nodded, recalling the officer whose eccentric methods had once confounded me. What of him? This cipher bears traces of a similar technique, a double substitution code layered with a numerical key. Ingenious, but not without its telltale signs. He tapped his pencil against a cluster of symbols. Here lies the repetition, the key to unraveling it. He worked in silence for a moment, his focus unyielding. Then, with a flourish, he leaned back in his chair, the faintest glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "The game is afoot, Watson," he declared. "This cipher is an invitation, a set of coordinates leading to an abandoned theater in Whitechapel." "An invitation?" I asked, leaning forward. "Indeed," Holmes said gravely. "Not a plea for rescue, but a summons to a sinister event. Tomorrow night, this theater will host a gathering, a clandestine meeting of minds, no doubt connected to the Shadow Syndicate." A chill ran through me. "And you mean to attend?" Holmes's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "We must. If we are to uncover Edward's fate and the Syndicate's designs, this invitation cannot be ignored." As the clock struck midnight, Holmes rose from his chair, his form silhouetted against the faint glow of the dying embers. "Watson," he said quietly, "the path ahead is treacherous. What lies beyond this cipher is a web of danger that may ensnare us both." I met his gaze, resolute. "Then let us tread it together, Holmes." He allowed himself a faint smile. "Very well. Tomorrow, we step into the shadows." And with that, the stage was set for a perilous journey into the heart of intrigue and danger. The evening air was damp with a lingering mist as we approached the crumbling facade of the abandoned theater. The structure loomed, its grandeur eroded by time and neglect. A faint murmur of voices reached us, muffled by the thick wooden doors. Holmes paused, his hand resting lightly on the iron handle. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, his eyes narrowing. "The faint scent of kerosene. Lamps have been lit recently. This place is not as forsaken as it appears." Pushing the door open, we stepped into a cavernous hall dimly illuminated by flickering gaslights. A group of men and women, their faces obscured by shadow, sat in a semicircle on the stage, their expressions inscrutable. At the center stood a man of sharp features and a commanding presence, his voice resonating with an air of authority. "Ah," Holmes whispered, gesturing subtly toward the man. "The orchestrator. Note the precision in his movements. This is no ordinary gathering, Watson. It reeks of deliberate intent." The room fell silent as the man raised a hand. "Welcome," he intoned. "Tonight you will be tested, not in strength, but in intellect. Success will grant you entry into a world few dare to imagine." A chill ran through me as Holmes leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "Stay vigilant, Watson. We are in the den of something far larger than we anticipated." One by one, the participants were called forward to solve riddles presented by the man on the stage. The questions were riddled with subtle traps, and failure was met with swift dismissal, an unceremonious gesture that left the rejected participants visibly shaken. Holmes observed with the keen detachment of a hawk, his gaze darting between the contestants and the orchestrator. "These riddles," he whispered to me, "are more than mere puzzles. They are filters, designed to sift through minds and uncover a specific intellect." The tension in the room mounted as the riddles grew more intricate. A woman in a dark cloak faltered on a question concerning ancient mathematical principles. The man on stage waved her away without a second glance. Finally, Holmes was called forward. His demeanor remained calm, almost dismissive, as the man posed a particularly convoluted riddle about historical cryptography. Holmes's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Your riddle is flawed," he said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "It assumes the cipher originates from 16th century England, yet its structure aligns with French codes of the Napoleonic era. The answer, therefore, is a misdirect. Clever, but not clever enough." The orchestrator's expression shifted ever so slightly, approval mixed with intrigue. Holmes stepped back, his face impassive. "Well played," the man said, his tone laden with unspoken meaning. As the final participant left the stage, the man addressed the remaining group. "You have proven yourselves worthy," he said, pacing before the semicircle. "But understand this: your intellect is a tool, a weapon to be wielded in service of a greater purpose." Holmes leaned closer to me, his voice barely above a whisper. "He speaks of recruitment, Watson. This charade was never about riddles. It is a selection process." The man continued, his voice rising. "Our aim is not mere knowledge, but power. Power tied to an artifact hidden within the shadows of London's history. Only those with minds capable of deciphering its secrets may partake in its discovery." Holmes's eyes narrowed as the pieces fell into place. "They seek the artifact Lady Evelyn's brother was decoding. A device, I suspect, of immense consequence. This game is but the prelude to a far more dangerous plot." The atmosphere grew heavier as we exchanged a glance. Beneath the theater's dim light, the true nature of our adversaries began to crystallize. We had stepped into a conspiracy far deeper than we had imagined, and the stakes were higher than ever. The orchestrator's voice resonated through the silent theater, each word steeped in calculated intent. "The artifact we seek," he declared, "is no ordinary relic. Hidden within the annals of London's history, it holds power enough to reshape the world." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he dissected every syllable. "Note his phrasing, Watson," he whispered. "He speaks not of history, but of potential. This artifact is both tangible and dangerous." The riddles Holmes had deduced were more than mere puzzles. Each one, when deciphered, contained fragments of information, coordinates, dates, cryptic references to historical events. Holmes's voice was low but urgent. "The clues align, Watson. The artifact they seek predates the Great Fire of London, concealed perhaps as a safeguard against its misuse. Its purpose, I suspect, is less benign." A woman seated to the left spoke up, her tone hesitant. "And when it is found?" The orchestrator's reply was chilling in its simplicity. "It will be used." I felt a chill settle over the room. Holmes's jaw tightened. "If they succeed, Watson, London itself could become a pawn in their machinations." As the gathering concluded, Holmes and I exchanged a glance heavy with unspoken understanding. The orchestrator's final words echoed ominously in my ears. "Tomorrow, the hunt begins." Holmes stood, his expression unreadable but his tone decisive. "Come, Watson, we have much to prepare." As we stepped into the fog-laden streets, the weight of the challenge ahead bore down on us. For the first time, I glimpsed the enormity of what lay ahead and the peril it promised. The cool night air greeted us as we emerged from the shadowy confines of the theater. Holmes's expression was inscrutable, though I could sense the wheels of his mind turning. "An extraordinary evening, Watson," he remarked, "though the true revelations remain ahead." As we turned onto the main road, I became aware of something amiss. The faint scuff of hurried footsteps echoed behind us, a sound barely perceptible above the distant hum of London's restless night. "Holmes," I murmured, "we are not alone." "I am aware," he replied quietly, his tone calm but firm. "Do not look back. Their intent is clear, but they have underestimated us." We continued walking, our pace measured. The footsteps behind us quickened, and Holmes leaned toward me, his voice barely audible. "When I give the word, turn left at the next alley. Keep your footing. These streets have more hazards than their occupants." A moment later, he whispered, "Now." We darted into the narrow alley, its cobblestones slick with rain. The air here was damp and close, carrying the faint scent of refuse and decay. Behind us, the footsteps quickened, joined now by low voices, a pursuit gaining momentum. Holmes navigated the twists and turns with the confidence of a man familiar with London's labyrinthine underbelly. I struggled to keep pace, my breath heavy as the sounds of our pursuers grew louder. "Stay close, Watson," Holmes called over his shoulder. "They are not professionals, but their numbers may prove troublesome." A sudden shout echoed behind us, followed by the unmistakable crack of a pistol. The bullet struck a wall to our right, sending a shower of brick dust into the air. "Desperate, but reckless," Holmes muttered, pulling me into a narrow passage. Inside, the cavernous space was alive with faint echoes. Machinery, long dormant, had been restored to function, and the hiss of steam punctuated the stillness. Scattered about were crates marked with foreign insignias, their contents hidden but undoubtedly sinister. Holmes knelt by a discarded paper, scanning its hastily scribbled notes. "This confirms it," he said gravely. "They are building a device capable of rerouting water pressure throughout the city. Controlled destabilization of water systems could wreak havoc on London's infrastructure. Flooding, shortages, collapse." My stomach churned at the implications. "They mean to hold the city hostage?" Holmes nodded. "And more. Their intentions are not confined to London, Watson. This is merely the beginning." A sound, a faint scuffle, pulled our attention to the shadows. Holmes gestured for silence, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness. From the shadows emerged a man, his gait hesitant yet familiar. Holmes stepped forward, his voice low but commanding. "Edward Blackthorne, I presume." The man flinched, his face pale and drawn, though his features bore a striking resemblance to Lady Evelyn's. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. Your sister sent us." Edward's eyes widened, a flicker of hope crossing his face before despair took hold. "You shouldn't be here. If they find you—" Holmes interrupted, his tone firm. "They will find nothing but failure if you assist us. Edward, you are a pawn in their game, but you hold the knowledge to end it." Edward hesitated, his gaze darting toward the shadows. "They watch me constantly," he whispered. "I was coerced, threatened. This device, it's capable of more destruction than you realize. They mean to cripple Europe's power structure, not just London." Holmes's expression hardened. "Then we must act swiftly. Tell me everything you know." Edward's shoulders slumped, the weight of his predicament evident. "I'll help you," he said at last, his voice barely audible. "But if they discover my betrayal—" Holmes placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Fear not, Mr. Blackthorne. You are no longer alone in this fight." The tension in the dimly lit room was palpable as Edward Blackthorne sat before us, his hands trembling slightly, his eyes darting toward the door as if expecting the shadowy figures of the syndicate to emerge at any moment. Holmes leaned forward, his voice calm but laced with authority. "Mr. Blackthorne, you must tell us everything. Time is a luxury we cannot afford." Edward hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. They mean to destabilize Europe, Mr. Holmes. The mechanism I was forced to design. It's capable of disrupting water supply systems on a massive scale. They plan to flood key cities and cripple entire regions, making governments powerless. I felt a chill run down my spine. "And their endgame?" I asked, my voice heavier than I intended. "To consolidate power," Edward replied, his gaze fixed on the floor. "They seek to dismantle alliances and create chaos, allowing them to rise as the sole authority. The artifact they speak of, it's central to the mechanism's operation. Without it, the device cannot function." Holmes's expression hardened, his sharp mind processing each word with rapid precision. "And this artifact, where is it kept?" Edward shook his head. "I do not know. They spoke of a transfer, but the location was never disclosed to me. I suspect they guard it more closely than anything else." Holmes stood, his tall frame casting a shadow over Edward. "Then we shall find it, Mr. Blackthorne. You have done your part, but the battle is far from over." As we stepped outside, the cool night air offered little solace from the weight of the revelation. The faint rustle of the Thames against the dock only deepened the silence between us. "Holmes," I said, breaking the quiet, "this syndicate, their reach is far greater than we imagined. How can we possibly dismantle such a network?" Holmes paused, his gaze fixed on the distant lights of the city. "Piece by piece, Watson. A grand design is often undone by the smallest flaw. We shall find that flaw and exploit it." His voice grew colder, edged with determination. "They threaten not merely a city but an entire continent. We cannot falter, no matter the peril." I nodded, the weight of the task settling on my shoulders. Together, we turned back toward Baker Street, our resolve steeled for the dangerous road ahead. Holmes stood by the window of our lodgings, his silhouette sharp against the faint light of dawn. The room was silent save for the rhythmic tapping of his fingers on the sill, a telltale sign that his mind was whirring. "Watson," he said abruptly, turning to face me, "the only way to dismantle the syndicate is from within. We must bait the trap." I frowned. "And who shall be the bait?" He regarded me with a glint of both apology and expectation. "You, my dear Watson." My protest formed but faltered as I met his steady gaze. "You propose that I feign capture," I said slowly, "to gain their trust and secure your entry into their lair?" "Precisely," Holmes replied. "The syndicate is ever watchful, yet they thrive on exploiting vulnerability. By presenting you as a captured adversary, they will lower their guard and provide me with an opening. It is a dangerous ruse, but a necessary one." I sighed heavily, the weight of the plan settling upon me. "And what if they decide to dispose of me instead of imprisoning me?" Holmes's expression softened, his tone resolute. "They will not. Your value as leverage will protect you, and rest assured, I shall not be far behind." With that, the plan was set, my role as bait secured. The syndicate's operatives found us on a fog-drenched street near the docks, their approach silent yet deliberate. Holmes and I had staged a convincing argument to draw their attention, culminating in my supposed defiance. "You'll regret this, Holmes," I growled, my voice raised enough to be heard by our hidden audience. Holmes responded with calculated indifference. "Do what you must, Watson. I have no room for sentiment." The operatives emerged, their weapons gleaming faintly in the dim light. One of them grabbed my arm, his grip rough. "You've chosen the wrong side, Doctor," he sneered. I struggled briefly, allowing them to subdue me. Holmes's expression remained cold, though I caught the faintest flicker of resolve in his eyes. As they dragged me away, my heart pounded with the dual weight of fear and trust. The syndicate's grip was firm, but my faith in Holmes was stronger. Holmes followed the operatives at a distance, his form shrouded in the dense mist that clung to the streets. His disguise, a dockworker's garb, was flawless, allowing him to slip past unnoticed. The syndicate's lair was a sprawling warehouse at the edge of the Thames, its exterior unassuming but its interior teeming with activity. Crates bearing foreign insignias lined the walls, and men moved about with purpose, their conversations a murmur of logistics and secrecy. Holmes's sharp eyes took in every detail. His focus sharpened as he spotted a guarded room at the far end of the warehouse. Slipping past the watchful sentries, he entered the chamber. Inside, the artifact lay on a raised platform, its intricate design illuminated by a single gas lamp. Holmes approached cautiously, his mind already piecing together its function. "It's more than a weapon," he murmured to himself, "a device of control, both physical and psychological, ingenious and terrifying." A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Admiring your handiwork, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes turned sharply to see a figure emerge from the shadows, a pistol in hand. The glint of betrayal in the man's eyes confirmed Holmes's suspicion. The game had taken a deadly turn, but Holmes's resolve remained unshaken. Holmes moved silently through the dimly lit chamber, the weight of the moment pressing heavily upon him. Before him stood the artifact, a marvel of engineering, its intricately interlocked gears and glass tubes humming faintly with energy. The room smelled faintly of oil and burnt metal, a testament to its sinister purpose. He leaned closer, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. The device was mounted on a heavy iron base with conduits snaking out in multiple directions, disappearing into the walls. Each component seemed designed to amplify a single purpose: controlled devastation. "Extraordinary," he murmured to himself, his voice barely audible. A mechanism that could flood entire districts with precision, targeting critical infrastructure to sow chaos. Ingenious, and yet utterly monstrous. Holmes's fingers hovered over a small lever on the device, but he hesitated. Tampering with it now would be unwise, he muttered. Its complexity suggests a failsafe. Any attempt to disable it could trigger its function prematurely. From the corner of his eye, he spotted a ledger resting on a nearby table. Flipping it open, he found schematics and notes, partial blueprints of the artifact's design, along with a timeline for its deployment. He grimaced, the pieces falling into place. This device is no prototype. It is operational, and they intend to use it imminently. Footsteps echoed faintly in the distance, snapping Holmes from his thoughts. He quickly pocketed the ledger, his mind racing with the implications. As Holmes stepped into the shadows, preparing to leave the chamber, a familiar voice rang out, laced with mockery. "Leaving so soon, Mr. Holmes?" Turning swiftly, Holmes found himself face to face with one of the syndicate's operatives, a man he had trusted as an informant in a previous case. The operative's pistol glinted in the dim light, its barrel trained steadily on Holmes. "You," Holmes said evenly, though his mind worked furiously. "I should have anticipated this. Your knowledge of the syndicate was too precise for mere observation." The man smirked. "You flatter me, Holmes, but flattery won't save you. The syndicate will reward me handsomely for delivering you." From the corner of the room, a faint noise caught both their attention. Watson, still bound but evidently unharmed, had managed to loosen his restraints. The operative turned, his focus momentarily diverted. Seizing the opportunity, Holmes lunged forward, his cane striking the man's wrist and sending the pistol clattering to the floor. The two men grappled briefly, their movements sharp and desperate. "Watson!" Holmes barked, his voice strained. "Now!" Watson surged forward, using his freed hands to subdue the operative. The scuffle ended quickly, leaving the man unconscious at their feet. Holmes adjusted his coat, his composure rapidly returning. "Our position is compromised," he said briskly. "We must act now before the syndicate realizes what we've uncovered." Watson nodded, his voice resolute. "Lead the way, Holmes. I'm with you." Together, they slipped into the corridors, the weight of their discovery and the specter of betrayal driving them onward. The distant tolling of a bell echoed through the city, its mournful sound swallowed by the cacophony of chaos spreading through London. Holmes and I had scarcely left the confines of Baker Street when the first signs of the syndicate's plan began to unfold. "Homes are flooding," Holmes remarked grimly, gesturing to the surge of water rushing along the street's edge. "The syndicate has begun manipulating the water systems. Their goal is clear: panic and destabilization." Citizens darted frantically through the streets, their voices rising in alarm. Steam hissed from broken pipes, and the acrid stench of burning oil filled the air. Holmes pressed forward, his stride determined, his mind already piecing together the puzzle. "Watson," he called over the din, "observe the pattern. The disruptions are not random. They are calculated to converge on a central point." I struggled to match his pace. "And that point is?" "The clock tower," Holmes replied, his voice sharp with certainty. "It is the one structure with the necessary height and power to amplify the artifact's effects. We must reach it before the final mechanism is activated." A courier stumbled past us, his satchel spilling papers onto the wet pavement. Holmes snatched one, scanning it quickly. "Confirmation," he murmured. "A schedule for the syndicate's operatives. The activation is imminent." We pressed on. the weight of urgency driving us through the chaos. London teetered on the edge, and the clock was quite literally ticking. The towering structure loomed in the distance, its spire piercing the dense fog that clung to the city like a shroud. Holmes led the way with unerring focus, every step bringing us closer to the epicenter of the syndicate's plot. "Holmes," I said breathlessly, "how do you propose we gain entry?" "The tower will surely be well guarded." "Precisely," he replied, his tone unflinching. "But the guards will expect an approach through the main entry. We shall take the maintenance passage instead, a route forgotten by most but noted in the city's architectural records." Reaching the base of the clock tower, Holmes uncovered a narrow door concealed behind a tangle of ivy. Producing a slender tool from his coat, he worked swiftly, the lock yielding with a faint click. The interior was a stark contrast to the pandemonium outside. The hum of machinery reverberated through the narrow stairwell, and the faint glow of gas lamps cast ominous shadows on the walls. "Upwards," Holmes commanded, his voice a whisper. "They will be stationed near the mechanism." We ascended cautiously, each step marked by the metallic clang of our boots. As we neared the top, Holmes halted abruptly, his hand raised for silence. Voices echoed from above, their words confirming our fears. "The artifact is primed," one said. "Once activated, there will be no turning back." Holmes turned to me, his expression resolute. "Watson, steel yourself. This is where the true battle begins." The chamber at the top of the clock tower was a labyrinth of gears and levers, its centerpiece the artifact itself, an intricate construct of steel and glass, pulsating with a menacing glow. Syndicate operatives surrounded it, their attention fixed on the final adjustments. Holmes motioned for silence, his gaze scanning the room with clinical precision. "Their positions are deliberate," he murmured. "Disrupting them will require precision." Before we could act, one of the operatives turned, his eyes narrowing as he spotted us. "Intruders!" he shouted, drawing a weapon. The room erupted into chaos. Holmes lunged forward, his cane striking the operative's hand and sending the pistol clattering to the ground. I engaged another, grappling to prevent him from reaching the artifact. "Watson!" Holmes called, his voice cutting through the noise. "The lever to your left. Disable it." I moved swiftly, dodging a blow and pulling the lever with all my strength. The artifact sputtered, its glow dimming momentarily before surging back to life. Holmes, meanwhile, had reached the control panel, his fingers dancing over the switches and dials. "The mechanism has redundancies," he muttered, "but even the most complex designs have flaws." An operative lunged at him, but Holmes sidestepped deftly, his cane striking with surgical precision. "Watson," he called, "hold them off a moment longer." "I am nearly finished." The air grew thick with tension as the artifact's hum intensified. Holmes's hands moved with frantic precision, his mind a fortress of focus. With a final twist of a dial, the artifact sputtered and fell silent, its malevolent glow extinguished. The room fell quiet, save for the labored breathing of our adversaries. Holmes straightened, his gaze steely. "London is safe," he declared, "but the Syndicate's game is far from over." The artifact loomed before Holmes, its intricate mechanism pulsating with ominous energy. The room thrummed with the vibration of whirring gears and the faint hiss of pressurized steam escaping its metal joints. Time was against us, and the air carried a suffocating weight of urgency. Holmes studied the device with an intensity that bordered on the supernatural. His fingers hovered over the complex arrangement of dials and levers, his eyes darting between the various components. "Watson," he called, his voice sharp but controlled, "observe the sequence of these gears. They are synchronized to create an amplification loop. Ingenious, but flawed." I nodded, though the intricacies of the mechanism eluded me. "And how do we stop it?" Holmes's hand moved swiftly to a valve at the base of the device. "By disrupting its rhythm," he explained. "The artifact relies on perfect synchronization. If we introduce even a minor deviation..." With a decisive twist, he adjusted the valve. The artifact sputtered, its hum momentarily faltering before resuming. "Not enough," Holmes muttered, his expression unyielding. He turned his attention to a series of copper wires, tracing them to their source. "These conduits distribute the energy. Severing them will destabilize the entire system." As he worked, the artifact's pulsations grew erratic. A warning bell sounded from within the device, its shrill tone slicing through the air. "Holmes," I cried, "the countdown, it's accelerating." He did not flinch. His hands moved with surgical precision, disconnecting the final wire. The artifact let out a deafening hiss, its glow fading to nothing as it fell silent. Holmes stepped back, his breath steady despite the chaos. "The mechanism is disabled," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "For now, the city is safe." As the room fell silent, a sound behind me drew my attention. A faint shuffle of footsteps, barely audible over the fading echoes of the mechanism's collapse. I turned, my heart sinking as I recognized the figure emerging from the shadows. "Barton," I said, my voice heavy with disbelief. "You?" The man stepped forward, his face a mask of cold determination. "You should have stayed out of this, Watson," he said. "You and Holmes meddle where you don't belong." Holmes turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "A traitor in our midst," he said quietly. "You've been feeding the syndicate information all along." Barton smirked, drawing a revolver from his coat. "And for good reason. Their vision is one of order, not chaos. Your interference threatens everything." I stepped between Barton and Holmes, my pulse quickening. "Whatever loyalty you believe they hold for you, it's a lie. They'll discard you the moment you outlive your usefulness." Barton hesitated, his grip faltering for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Holmes to act. With a deft movement, he disarmed Barton, the revolver clattering to the floor. Holmes's voice was ice. "You've made your choice, Barton. Now you'll face the consequences." As we secured Barton, the weight of betrayal hung heavy in the air. But there was no time to dwell. The syndicate's shadow loomed still, and our work was far from over. The morning after the harrowing events at the clock tower, Holmes and I arrived at Scotland Yard with a dossier that could topple the syndicate. Inspector Lestrade, though skeptical at first, soon recognized the weight of the evidence we presented. "Holmes," Lestrade said, his tone edged with incredulity, "if even half of what's in this dossier is true, this syndicate is the most dangerous entity we've ever faced." "Precisely," Holmes replied, his voice measured. "The artifact was but one piece of their plan. This network spans far beyond London, and their ambitions extend into the heart of Europe. These documents," he gestured to the stack, "contain records of their communications, coded ledgers, and the identities of several key operatives." Lestrade leafed through the pages, his expression darkening with each turn. "This is explosive, Holmes. With these names, we can apprehend their leadership." "Act swiftly, Lestrade," Holmes warned. "The syndicate's strength lies in its ability to vanish. Strike while their resources are scattered." Within hours, Scotland Yard mobilized, executing raids across the city. Reports trickled in of arrests, men whose names matched the ledgers we had recovered. Each apprehension was a blow to the syndicate's foundation. Yet, even as I watched the wheels of justice turn, I noticed the faint shadow of unease cross Holmes's face. "You've accomplished what you set out to do," I said, hoping to reassure him. Holmes shook his head. "Not entirely, Watson. This is a victory, but a hollow one if the syndicate's unseen leaders remain at large. There are still shadows we have yet to illuminate." Later that evening, Lady Evelyn arrived at Baker Street, her face a mixture of relief and apprehension. Edward Blackthorne, her brother, followed closely behind, his countenance pale and weary. "Edward," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "you're safe now." He nodded, though his expression betrayed an inner torment. "Safe, yes," he replied softly. but not without cost. Holmes stepped forward, his gaze steady. "Mr. Blackthorne, you acted under duress. The syndicate thrives on coercion, but your knowledge was critical to their undoing. Do not let guilt cloud what was, in essence, an act of survival." Edward hesitated, then turned to his sister. "I never wanted to betray what I believed in, Evelyn. They threatened you, your life. I had no choice." Lady Evelyn clasped his hands tightly. "You're alive, Edward. That is all that matters to me now." As they spoke, I observed Holmes quietly. His sharp eyes were fixed on Edward, yet there was a rare softness in his expression, a recognition of the human cost in their struggle. "You'll need time to recover," Holmes said finally, "but your expertise will be invaluable in helping to dismantle what remains of the syndicate. Consider it an act of penance, if you must, but do not squander this opportunity." Edward nodded solemnly. "I will do whatever I can." In the days that followed, London began to breathe again. The flooding receded, the broken infrastructure was repaired, and the city's pulse, though shaken, steadied once more. As we walked through the bustling streets, Holmes remained quiet, his sharp gaze absorbing the sights and sounds of recovery. The resilience of the people was evident in their determined faces, yet a lingering unease hung in the air, a shadow left by the syndicate's actions. "Remarkable, isn't it, Watson?" Holmes said at last. "Remarkable indeed," I replied, "but I sense you are not entirely at ease." He stopped, turning to face me. "The city may recover, but the syndicate's remnants will not disappear so easily. Their ambition extends beyond this skirmish. For every name we uncovered, there are others, faceless, nameless, who will rise to take their place." I sighed. "You've done more than anyone could ask, Holmes. You've given the city a fighting chance." He inclined his head, a faint smile playing at his lips. "Perhaps. But the allure of power is a shadow that lingers, Watson. It is a game without end." As we returned to Baker Street, I couldn't help but reflect on his words. London was safe for now, but the shadows Holmes spoke of loomed ever larger, waiting for their next move. The fire crackled softly in the hearth at Baker Street as Holmes sat in his chair, his fingertips steepled and his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the room. The events of the past days hung heavy in the air, a palpable reminder of how close London had come to calamity. "You seem unusually pensive, Holmes," I remarked, breaking the silence. "Surely the syndicate's defeat warrants a sense of triumph." Holmes glanced at me, his expression enigmatic. "Triumph, Watson, is a transient thing. While we may celebrate the disruption of their plans, we must not delude ourselves into thinking the danger is past. Power, you see, is a most intoxicating force." I set my cup down, intrigued by his tone. "You fear the syndicate's ambitions will inspire others." "Fear is too strong a word," he replied, his voice measured, "but I am certain of it. The allure of control, the ability to shape society according to one's design, it is a temptation few can resist. The syndicate's downfall is but one chapter in an ongoing tale. For every villain unmasked, there are others waiting in the wings, emboldened by the shadows left behind." The weight of his words settled heavily upon me. "And yet, we must believe that justice prevails, Holmes. Otherwise, what purpose do we serve?" A faint smile flickered across his face, though his eyes remained distant. "Purpose, my dear Watson, is the very anchor that steadies us amidst the storm, and it is in the pursuit of justice that we find ours." The next morning, a light fog shrouded Baker Street, softening the edges of the bustling city beyond. As I prepared to leave for the day, Holmes stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the streets below. "Watson," he said suddenly, "do you see that man across the way?" I joined him, following his gaze to a figure standing at the corner, cloaked and unremarkable save for the way he lingered, his attention fixed on our lodgings. "A syndicate operative?" I asked. Holmes nodded slightly. One of many, no doubt. Their defeat was but a setback, and they will rebuild, as such organizations always do. The game continues, Watson, though its players may change. The figure disappeared into the crowd, and Holmes turned away from the window. Let us remain vigilant. The shadows may recede, but they are never truly gone. With those words, Holmes retreated to his chair, his violin resting nearby. As the notes of a somber melody filled the room, I couldn't help but feel the weight of his unspoken thoughts. The shadows that remained were a reminder that our work was far from finished.